Thanks to Ryan and Rob for inviting us back to continue this conversation around self-care and the cost of caring and being in this field. Just to kind of kick off and share a little bit about the center, we're located here in Columbus, Ohio, as part of Nationwide Children's Hospital. And what we do is we work to break the cycle of violence through a multidisciplinary approach that brings together health, healing, safety under one building. And it's kind of a unique collaboration here in our community and across the nation. And it's really cool to be able to be in this field and talk about working with trauma survivors and how we take care of ourselves in the work that we do each and every day. So a little bit about the center, just real brief. If you can see, we're kind of broken up into some different buckets. The purple one, we have children's services with us. We have a division of our local police department that's here. We have some victim witness advocates from the prosecutor's office. We have a child assessment center. We have a training and prevention arm, which is currently me right now, providing this training. We also have a Help Me Grow and family support program and a home-based program. And then we have a whole services for adults. One of the things that I like to share that people may not recognize is we have from our police department a canine unit. They're called therapy dogs that come into our office all the time. And what you see is Kit and Mattis up there in the picture. And they actually have attended court with some of our adult-based survivors to help them while they're going through the court process. So it's kind of a different spin on some of the services in ways that we kind of look at being trauma-informed for our community. The other thing that I always like to share is the picture in the very left-hand corner of the stuffed animals. Every child that's seen through our center, after they've been given an exam, at the end of that, they get to take away a stuffed animal. And we call that Abigail's Corner. And they get to do that each time that they have an exam. And it helps them kind of just process so that this wasn't such a traumatic, scary place where they had to share their story again, but that there's something kind of good that comes out of the end of it. And we just kind of like to share that with everyone because a lot of times people get to know us for all the work we do around trauma, and they don't always see some of the highlights that we try to instill in this work as well. So today's agenda, as you can see, we're really looking at how do we define the difference between compassion fatigue and compassion satisfaction, looking at resilience factors and how we really enhance those resilience factors that we have within ourselves. Have any of you ever been to one of those trainings where they kind of discuss the problem, then give some tools at the end real fast? I've probably been the person in the audience going, okay, yeah, I know the problem, but how do I fix it? Give me the tools, cut to the end, show me the secret formula that'll allow me to be a superhero in the work that I do. And I know I'm probably not alone in that. As a trainer, what I've found is now I better understand why we spend so much time defining and identifying the problem. Solutions often oversimplify the problem and alienate individuals who are then left feeling unheard, invalidated, or might even think there's something wrong with them because we didn't take the time to talk about what the problem really is. This is why we start with an understanding and awareness to define what is occurring first and then to offer tools and strategies at the end. Now, I can't see any of you like I would typically do in an in-person training, so whether or not you take these tools and strategies, it's completely up to you. But I do hope that you have ears to hear today and that you're willing for the next hour to go on this journey to talk about self-care and the cost of doing the work that we do. So the first thing I'd like to share with you guys, when I was at the SEMER Institute Summit in October, which was really wonderful, it was a really incredible experience. One of the things that I kicked off kind of my training was to ask the participants to describe something about their role that's positive in 1 to 2 words. And what you can see on this screen is the word cloud that group of individuals generated together. And some of the things that stand out to me when I look at this word cloud is the fact that people and helping came up again and again and again, really reminding us why we're in this field. The other things that kind of stick out to me were agency, impact, and building. And so we start this and we start trainings like this because when we can identify the positive aspects before we start to discuss the negative ones, we have a space to come back to. We ground ourselves in the resilience of this work. So since I've started these trainings in this way, it's really helped set the tone of the conversation and allows space for everyone to participate collectively. And then as we talk about some of the more negative things, we can come back and remind ourselves of why we're here to begin with. And so I hope that you can look at this and connect with it in a way. And if any of you saw me before, I hope you see your word up there on the word cloud. So let's get started and really talk about what does it cost to care? You know, that's what we're doing in this field. That's what we kind of sign up for when we take on these roles. We're really kind of in two different buckets that end up happening. So when we provide services, we might find that we have compassion satisfaction, or we might find that we have compassion fatigue. Now, when we talk about satisfaction, we're talking about the times when we provide services, we feel good about the work we do. We have a sense of purpose and pride in our work. We see this occur more often when organizations have a trauma-informed mindset for both the people they serve and for their staff and employees. And I want to be really clear when I say staff and employees, I don't just mean direct service providers. I don't just mean your clinical staff. I really mean everyone, from the front desk person that's answering phones and greeting clients for the first time to the janitor that helps take care of the building. When we really come together around trauma-informed, we acknowledge and validate the impact of working in this field where we have people who have experienced trauma, and we honor the work that everyone's doing collectively together. Now, on the flip side, we have compassion fatigue. And that's our umbrella term for when the cost of caring has a negative outcome. And some of the research shows anywhere from 25% all the way up to 70% of new professionals that are inexperienced in mental health start to feel this sensation of compassion fatigue. And I know that that's a large number to think about, but think back, if you're not a new member to this field, like think back to when you first entered and how joyous you might have been and how excited you were and how much you were going to save people, or you were going to do so much and you're going to make this change. And then maybe think about where you are now, right? And the reason compassion fatigue is so important to recognize is that when it goes unchecked, we start to see fatigue spread to others in the organization. So when that new professional enters the field and they're exposed to the veteran workers who have been operating out of vicarious trauma, they often are then exposed to that veteran worker's way of dealing with it, their coping skills. And if their coping skills are unhealthy, or the agency's response is unhealthy, or maybe even what we would consider toxic, that new worker will start to adapt those survival skills to be able to do the job. It kind of gets summed up in, well, this is just what it takes to do the job. And those coping skills can really burn someone out, but also can be a sign of vicarious trauma that kind of spreads to everyone else. They have that saying of negativity spreads, and this is one of the ways that we see it. Positivity, I would challenge, can also spread as well. So let's talk a little bit more about some of that negative process that's kind of happening. Because when we talk about compassion fatigue, we're talking about a parallel process that's happening between clients, staff, and organizations. This is all occurring at the same time, but I'm going to kind of break it down to explain it. So if you look at clients and you look about halfway down your screen, you see the word helpless. It's bolded, it's a little bit of a bigger font, trying to make it easy for everyone to see. Now, when we work with clients who are starting to feel helpless, as staff, we might become frustrated because we're not quite sure how to help that client. Or we might feel like, what am I supposed to do? I'm trying all these things and nothing's working. And when we continue to experience frustration again and again and again as a staff member, our organizations start to feel stuck. What am I supposed to do to help my staff? How am I supposed to get more funding? How am I supposed to make these needs happen? My hands are tied too. I don't know what to do. And everyone's kind of running around in this vicious cycle of not knowing what to do. And oftentimes, this parallel process isn't happening one right after the other. It's probably co-occurring all at the same time, because you're not just meeting with one client and then the next. You have a whole agency of people meeting with clients. And so all of these things are happening. So whether you start with clients or you start with the organization, you really could start wherever you want in this parallel process and kind of track it to the other sections to say, oh, I'm not alone in feeling this, that there's a real outcome that's happening for the other people that this is impacted by. It's not just me siloed off as a worker having this issue. This is much larger than that, especially when we talk about compassion fatigue. It doesn't just mean that this is an individual's problem. This often means we need to address those environments, including organizations. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at what I mean by that, because oftentimes when I'm talking about parallel process, I hear people talk, well, yeah, it's just stress. We're all just stressed out, which might be true. We might experience stress. I'm sure everyone's experienced stress, and that's perfectly normal. When we start to think about what it costs organizations, it's about 150 billion to 300 billion annually due to job-related stress that employers spend every year dealing with stress-related outcomes. So this could be staff who lose empathy, this could be increased healthcare costs, staff who take time off or no-show, well, unscheduled time off, and then also turnover rates. All of this is contributing to the cost that organizations have to pay every single year. So when someone says like, well, your stress isn't my problem, when we look at organizations, we say, yeah, actually that employee's stress is part of the problem for the organization. You're losing money every year, and a lot of money is coming out of it because we're not taking care of our staff. So when we look at staff who lose empathy, what I mean by this is when staff lose empathy, their ability to be productive and to interact with clients and to do their job to the best of their ability is really impacted. So clients start to get shifted to other cases. There's more mistakes on paperwork, which has to be redone or recorrected. So now we're paying for staff to fix mistakes or other staff to fix those mistakes. And then those staff become impacted by the person who has a loss of empathy. They may start to feel like, well, I don't really want to be around that person because it's negative, or I really don't want to be over here because now I have to take on this person's caseload. When we look at increased healthcare costs, we start to think about what does stress do to your body and your mind? Stress does damage, and when the stress hormone cortisol is released into our systems over a long period of time, our bodies aren't meant to sustain that. Cortisol is meant to help us survive life-threatening situations like seeing a bear in the woods. Typically, after that encounter, we may not go into the woods for a long time, and the cortisol would leave our system. We would balance out, and we would reach a more equilibrium. But what happens when your bear isn't in the woods? What if your bear's at work? What if your bear's in the community? What if your bear's even someone you come home to? Our bodies are not meant to be in survival mode for an extended period of time. When they are, we start to see more health issues, whether they're physically related to our bodies or even mentally with our mind. We also see an increase in chronic pain symptoms with the higher levels of stress. So now you have a staff that's trying to manage chronic pain on top of trying to do a job. When we look at unscheduled time off or no-showing, we again are talking about the shifting the burden to other staff, and now the organization is trying to scramble to meet clients' needs with limited staff member, and that burden has shifted to the other staff as well. They might start to feel like, well, can I take time off? I better not get sick because I've covered for other people and I know how crappy that is. So now I feel like I can't even get sick because I wouldn't want to put that burden on someone else. And so we start to see staff not really able to take care of themselves because there's this system that isn't set up to support them. And lastly, we start to see turnover rates. And I don't mean just staff leaving, because that's definitely a problem that we see occur, but we also see organizations start to lose their credibility in the community. So now they're might struggle to hire quality professionals. When an organization becomes labeled as toxic because they have such high turnover, other professionals in the community might tell a new professional to say, hey, I don't know if you should take that job. I've seen it posted 3 times in the last 2 years. Seems like no one can really stay there. I don't know if it's worth it. And that then adds burden to the organization because now they're left with people who may not be the best fit for the job that they're trying to hire and train and get put into this field, and they may not be ready, or they might be somewhere else in their trauma and resilience journey, and this might not be the best fit for them, but you're trying to make it work with the limited resources you have. So when we talk about stress costing organizations, and that this is a real thing to think about as an organizational level, this is what we're talking about. We're thinking about all these different components. Now, when we shift to kind of thinking about what's happening for direct service workers, or really anyone in this field, we're going to start talking about some of those buckets that were underneath compassion fatigue. The first one that we look at is moral distress. And moral distress occurs when we know what the right thing to do is based on our ethics, but we feel unable to take action due to internal or external influences. When I think about ethics, I think about how I'm a social worker, and so I have a whole code of conduct that I have to follow on top of whatever my agency has. But I am, by my license, I am bound to follow this code of conduct. And when there's conflict between the policy and procedure and what the right thing to do is, that creates tension that really weighs us down in this work. And sometimes we see that be like inappropriate use of resources, saying that we're going to give false hope to a client. Just get them through. Just tell them that this thing's going to work out, but we have no idea, instead of being honest with them. Or enforcing policies that restrict a client's freedom. And really, we start to see this happen a lot in multidisciplinary teams because we all come at it from a different place. I, as a social worker, am here for my client, but if I'm working with a hospital or a school or a police officer or all these different spaces, they might have a different goal at the end of the day, and all of our goals may not align if we aren't rooted in trauma-informed care, right? We might all be approaching this for different reasons, and we're not really there to make sure that the client is okay. And that can happen with social workers. Social workers could be in it for whatever reason, or as a case manager, there's all kinds of different places that we come from. And when we don't come from the same mindset of trauma-informed, then that's where we start to wonder, okay, why am I feeling this tension? Sometimes what we've seen when it comes to moral distress is that social workers or whoever, right, you might reach out to a supervisor and say, I'm trying to navigate the situation, but I don't know how to navigate it. And the supervisor might insist that you conform, or there's pressure to say, that's not really real, or that's not as big of a thing as you're making it. Just do your job. Just move forward. Just keep moving on. And sometimes people might even face bullying, retaliation, or intimidation. And in extreme cases, we've seen some termination because these people who are starting to feel moral distress to say, this isn't matching what we're trying to do, they can be seen as a whistleblower. And organizations aren't going to want to deal with that. And we have to acknowledge that that's something that can happen. And so if you're sitting with that whole burden then feels like it's placed on you. That can really weigh you down because you feel like the organization and your supervisor and the structure and the system itself isn't really hearing you. And when the system doesn't hear you, that's where we start to see it contribute to burnout. Now, burnout is emotional exhaustion from organizational structure. It's not necessarily the exposure to trauma, like working with clients all the time, but it's the organizational structure isn't working. So sometimes this could be around supervision. You're not able to see your supervisor, or when you are, they're really distracted, or they keep pushing off or canceling your supervision. There might just be a lack of resources in general. You could hear about an increased workload. So, hey, we got our funding this year, but now they're saying we have to increase the amount of people we serve, but we still have to get everything done in the same amount of time, right? Increasing demands and not allowing enough time for you to actually do the job or get the paperwork done. Organizational stress. So what if there's a lot of turnover at the top hierarchy, right? If there's changes in leadership, if there's changes in management, that can make a lot of stress for the people on the ground level and doing direct services. And oftentimes what we really see with burnout is that it's developed over a period of time. What I often hear when someone's talking about burnout is someone saying, like, I'm doing more for the agency than they have done for me. Like, I'm trying to get all these things done, and what's happened here? And as you can see, there's a couple little signs right there about the different types of burnout. You might feel headaches, muscle tension. You might have trouble with sleeping. You might just not want to come into work. That's usually a good check-in with yourself. You might feel just really frustrated about what am I doing and why am I even doing this? Now, when we switch into talking about secondary traumatic stress, secondary traumatic stress and vicarious trauma, I think, are getting more and more well known. For the longest time, we've always just kind of called it burnout. But now we're starting to better understand what we're seeing. And when we talk about secondary traumatic stress, we're talking about a normal reaction to at least one indirect exposure to a traumatic event. Now, that could be indirect or direct, and it's usually within the first couple of times it happens. So an indirect exposure could be a client sharing how they've been hurt by someone in the past, like a parent or a previous romantic partner. Direct exposure could be witnessing the trauma occurring. So maybe you were in the session and you were in the home and you witnessed something, or you were on your way to or from and you were just in the community and you witnessed something traumatic happening. That exposure is what starts to bring up the symptoms and the presence of PTSD. And so you might start to feel like my neighborhood's unsafe, or you might have some anxiety about going to meet in the home, or you may feel really paralyzed or depressed. These are all natural symptoms and normal symptoms that occur when you've been exposed to trauma. And the most effective intervention after being exposed to trauma, whether it's direct or indirect, is to have space to safely debrief the incident with a supervisor. Even a coworker can be helpful. What it does, it allows the brain to start processing the event and sets up for healthy coping skills to use right then or if needed in the future. But it really gives the brain a chance to process and start moving forward instead of that person taking this experience, bearing it down deep, and kind of just moving forward with their day and never really talking about it. We really do need space to debrief the things that happen in all of our jobs so that we can figure out how to have healthy buffering to move forward with it. Now, if you don't get that space to debrief and you have to kind of push it down and you just keep doing the job and it just kind of becomes a normal part of how you've adapted to survive, that's where we start to see something called vicarious trauma. And it's a cumulative process of change, meaning it happens over a long period of time. And what we really see is that it shifts the way that you look at the world and how you interact, not only in your professional life, but even in your personal life. We're in the business of helping people who might have experienced terrifying violence and profound loss, and that's going to weigh on us. That's going to, we have to acknowledge what that's going to do for us. And when we don't have that space to debrief, then we start to say, how has your worldview changed because of the work you're doing? That's a really great question to ask if you're wondering if someone has vicarious trauma. Really sitting with them and saying, has your worldview changed because of your work? Are you starting to look at the world and say, well, nothing's safe, or I have to do these new safety measures in my routine because of the work that I'm doing, or I've changed how I've done this, right? And if it's negatively impacting that person's life, that's what we're talking about with vicarious trauma. Now, vicarious trauma comes from a variety of places. Like I said, it could be exposure to traumatic stories. It could be exposure to just even the client or family's reaction to a trauma event. So they're telling you about it, but their reaction as they're retelling the story kind of triggers something for you. It could be being directly exposed to a client's re-victimization, thinking about if you had to attend a court process with them or if you had to attend a really big meeting and the client was kind of re-traumatized in that meeting and you were present for it. That could be exposure. But the biggest thing that I hear about is people telling me that it feels like they're trying to confront the worst of humanity on behalf of their clients, and they have to act as if this is a normal response, that this is just the day-to-day of what we do, day in and day out. And yes, it is what we do day in and day out, but it isn't normal. These things are horrible events that happen, and our clients are experiencing real profound loss, like I said. And so we really need to acknowledge that and allow space for everything to not just be okay, because sometimes things aren't okay, and it's okay for them to not be okay, as many times as I just said okay. The other thing that I hear a lot when it comes to vicarious trauma is, oh, that person's just burnt out. They're just jaded. Don't talk to them. They've been in the field too long. And if you find yourself in that position, saying those things about other people, I would invite you to consider whether the symptoms that you're seeing in those other coworkers or individuals are from burnout, or are they actually experiencing vicarious trauma? Often experienced workers who have been in this field for a long time have been dealing with vicarious trauma the best way they know how without knowing that it was vicarious trauma. And they've adapted survival skills that have gotten them to the present in order for them to keep doing this work. And no one was really there to say, hey, I think this might be what you're experiencing. They were kind of left on their own to figure it out. And it may not be the healthiest way that they're coping, but we can still honor their survival skills while providing them a safe space to say, it's okay. And we all experience this, and to normalize that this is a part of the work that we do, that there is nothing wrong with you as an individual, that you are not any less, and that you can't do your work. You are very much a worthy person, and you are very much a person that can do this work. And this is an outcome of doing the work that we do. And it's okay that this happens. We just want to make sure that everyone's safe and that they have space to safely process this so that we can keep people in this field for the long term instead of the short term. So let's talk a little bit more and shift our focus from discussing compassion fatigue to compassion satisfaction. And let's really talk about self-care, as much as a buzzword as it is. When we talk about engaging in self-care, we're really talking about self-care being a part of an ethical service provider, which we all are, and that it's essential in how we stay in this field. So for the remainder of their time today, I want you to consider how these tools that we discussed build and maintain your own resilience. And then after you've kind of sat with that with me today, think about, is there ways that you could use these with your clients? But first, we really want to focus in on how do you use these tools and how do you define your own resilience journey? Because we always have to start with ourselves. So top 5 resilience factors. What I'd like everyone to do, and I'm probably going to be a horrible timekeeper, so hopefully my colleagues will keep me on time for this. I'd like everyone to grab a piece of paper. If you're not already taking notes, grab a pen. If you are more electronic like I am, go ahead, grab a tablet, grab a phone, grab a laptop, open up a browser. Just make a space where you can write some of these things down. As I go through each of the 5 resilience factors, I'm going to be asking you questions and asking you to just jot down some notes as we go along. So let's get started with number 5. Number 5 is autonomy. And really, we're talking about our own sense of control, our own sense of agency. And what this factor is really talking about is the ability to have a voice, the ability to have choice, and the ability to have control and the sense of power with. And power with means that you are balancing those scales. So you don't have power over someone, but instead you're actually walking alongside them in their journey. So what I'd like to ask all of you to consider for the next 30 seconds to a minute and jot down is it power over or power with to have power to make things happen? All right. I feel like I should get some Jeopardy music for in there. Do, do, do. No, you didn't lose your audio, I promise. I was giving everyone just 30 seconds to kind of think about it, and you guys can come back to this, and we'll have the PowerPoint for everyone after this webinar, so you can kind of come back to it. But what I most often hear, because when I usually do this, I'm talking to a room full of people, and I like to get people to kind of think about this and then respond back and give me some answers. That way we can kind of share in our resilience journeys. And so since I don't really have that, I'll share what I often hear that people talk with me about. So when we talk about power with, we're really talking about using power in a dynamic way that we get on the same level as another person. For instance, if I'm meeting with someone and they're sitting when I walk in, I'll sit first and then introduce myself so I'm physically on the same level as them. By doing this, I'm keeping their thinking brain and their cortex online with me to engage in the conversation. So our ability to sit, have conversation, to be logical, rational, that all comes from our thinking brain, the top part of our brain. Now, if the person had to look up to me and I stood over top of them, not only physically do I have a power dynamic that I have all the power by standing over top of them, but when they have to look up to another person, that starts to activate the fear center of their brain. And that makes it really hard for them to pay attention as far as to be able to have a conversation, to think logically. Their brain is in survival mode, wondering what kind of threat do I pose by standing over top of them. And so we really want to be able to keep people online with their thinking brain and engaged, so we always want to meet them with wherever they're at. One of the stories I like to share in this is that when I talk about autonomy and agency, I always talk about learning about the hand brain. And again, I can't show it to you guys right now, but there's some really great videos out there. Dr. Dan Siegel, so I'll say it again, Dr. Dan Siegel, he's amazing. He came up with the hand brain. If you Google him, he's got a lot of great YouTube videos out there, and it's just a way to kind of understand how our brain works. If we can understand how our brain works, we are giving ourselves control to realize that, oh, our brain's doing exactly what it was meant to do for survival, and that I'm not crazy, and that I'm not weird, that this is my brain doing a natural response so that I can survive in these moments. Now, I work with teens, and I talk with them about relationships, which can always be an interesting conversation. I'm never quite sure what I'm going to get with them. And one day I was working with a group, and this teenager, like, they just weren't ready to talk about relationships that day, which was perfectly fine. So I came in, I sat down. They really just were having a day. And I said, do you guys want to learn something about your brain? And they were like, sure. And so off the cuff, I decided to teach them about the hand brain. And we walked through it. I talked about the fear center, and I talked about their thinking brain and how sometimes in certain situations we're triggered. And that's when our thinking brain goes offline. And we're not really able to be present with other people because we're concerned for our safety. And we may not even recognize that our brain's doing this. And as I did that conversation, I walked away and thought nothing of it, right? I taught somebody, hoped that the teens took something out of it, but wasn't quite sure if they really did. And it wasn't until I came in the next week that I found out how much of an impact that had on the group that I was training. One of the students, his grandma came in to talk to the instructor, and what she shared was that her grandson's father had been incarcerated 6 months ago, and that he had come to live with her. And in that 6 months, he hadn't really shared anything with his grandma. They weren't really able to talk. Most of the conversations, he would give 1 to 2 word answers, and that was pretty much as far as it went. And they had been living in kind of this tension for the last 6 months. And after our session that day, the previous week, he got into the car with his grandma, and his grandma asked him how his day was going. And he said, fine. And then she started to ask a few more questions. And what he shared, or what he told her, was, Grandma, you just don't understand how my brain works. And it was a pivotal moment. It changed the whole conversation because he was able to then start talking about all these things that he hadn't shared with her before because he felt like she didn't understand him. And it really opened this doorway of communication. So when we can give people the tools to better understand why they're having the trauma responses they're having, when we can recognize why we ourselves might be having the trauma responses we're having, it gives us the ability to have agency and control over ourselves. To remind ourselves that we are not crazy, that we are not wrong or weird or different, that this is normal and a very normal part of how our brain works in order for us to thrive. Now, the next resilience factor is self-esteem. And there's a couple of different things that come with self-esteem. So sense of self is kind of like, what do I like? What do I not like? When we look at our self-worth, when do you feel loved, valued? And when we look at self-efficacy, we start to look at, well, how do I affect change? And what's my power of influence? Because we all have the ability to influence the things around us. We all have power in a different way. Even if you think about just like your work with clients, you have the power to influence clients. If you're a supervisor, you have the power to influence your staff. If you're someone that answers the door, or you're a receptionist, like when you answer the phone and you say, hi, this is so-and-so, right? Your ability to be kind in that moment can influence how the person on the other end receives that. And so what I'd like you guys to consider for the next 30 seconds is, how do I use and how do I want to use my powers of influence? All right, definitely need to get Jeopardy music moving forward. Just get a little soundtrack going. So one of the things that we talk about in this resilience factor is talking about the 5 good things. Like I said, I talk with a lot of people about relationships, and what I've found is that people don't really always know about healthy relationships. And when we talk about the 5 good things, we're really talking about, what do you get when you have a healthy relationship? When you're with somebody that gives you a healthy relationship, or you're in a culture, organization, on a team that is a healthy team. And so what you get from that are things like zest. Zest is that feel-good energy. It gives you a little zip. It makes you feel energized. It really is like that feel good that kind of keeps you coming back and wanting to hang out or wanting to be around those other people. When you also have a healthy relationship, you're looking at everything's kind of clear. There's a clarity in it. You're not confused about what your role is or what other people are doing. You kind of are all on the same page, and you can have clear communication with one another. You're also able to increase your sense of self-worth because then you're feeling like you're valued on a team. You're feeling like you're valued with the people around you. And when you feel all of these things, you are more creative and you are more productive. When you're surrounded by unhealthy and toxic environments, your body's dealing with all of that stress, your mind's dealing with all that stress, you're constantly frustrated, you might even be feeling all of the things that we were talking about earlier, and that's taking away from your ability to be productive in that space because you're worried about all the other stuff that's happening. When you're in a healthy environment, you're probably going to feel more creative. You might come up with really creative solutions to help your clients or to help your staff or to help your coworkers. And so it really kind of pulls all of that together. The last thing that we look at is the desire for more connection. When I talk about relationships, if you're sitting thinking like, ugh, I don't want to see that person, or ugh, I just don't want to go in today. Again, those should all be cues to check in with yourself to say, what is this really doing for me? Is this really the best fit for me in this moment? And could I be doing something else, or do I need to look at where I'm going for the future? Now, let's talk about number 3, which is external supports. And this is probably the one that's the most odd, I would say, only because when people look at it, they're like, okay, yeah, it could be a person. I could, have support from another person. I could have support from a pet, right? You could even have a plant, and I know that might sound odd, but when you have to care and, be there for a plant just doesn't survive unless it's a weed on its own. It needs water and sunlight. Sometimes you have to change out the soil in the new pot. Like, you're caring for another living thing, right? So anytime that we have that connection to other living things, that can be really helpful. What it does is when someone helps us, our brain releases dopamine. Dopamine is a calming chemical that helps your fear center calm down to bring the thinking brain back online. When someone helps us, or when we help someone else, our brain releases twice the amount of dopamine. So if you're getting help from someone, your brain's going to go, hey, here's some dopamine. But if the person's helping you, you get twice the amount. And if you help someone in return, you're going to get twice the amount. So think about why we're in this field. We're always helping people. Our brain's constantly giving us dopamine and making us feel good and calming us down because we're helping other people. There's science to back up why you want to do this work and the feelings that you get. And it's your brain saying like, hey, this is a good thing. Now, healing happens in relationships. And when we think about relationships, we also start to ask ourselves, like, what's our system of meaning? How do I make sense of my world? These are questions that people often ask. And we can think about systems of meaning in a traditional sense. We can think about relationships in a traditional sense, like healthy, safe adult. But it could be untraditional. Maybe it is a fantasy, or maybe I connect into a higher power or a belief system that gives me hope. And why this is important is because we need hope to keep us moving forward. We need the ability to say that tomorrow could be different from today. We need to be able to believe in something. And when I do group work with adults, I tell them it doesn't matter what you believe in. That's perfectly fine, even if it differs from me. As long as you have a belief in something, that something gives you the hope for the future. And that's really what we're looking at. Because when you've lost that hope for the future and you've lost that belief in something, then I start to wonder, is it possible that you might be considering like suicidal ideation, right? Is it possible that you no longer want to be here? And so having that hope really is a core of the resilience, right? Being able to look at the future and say, this could be different from what I'm experiencing today. Number 2 is affiliation. And really that's just a fancy word for having a sense of belonging, right? Where do I connect in with? What groups do I belong to? If you just look around and you think about all the different pockets that you have in your life, who's in your pocket when you look at professionally? Like, who do you connect with? Who do you connect with outside of work? Friends, family? Do you have a book club? Is there an extracurricular activity? Do you have people that you meet at the gym? Or do you have people that you meet at the dog park? I'm trying to think of where people meet people outside of a bar. That might be your thing too. It's just, where do you belong? And at the end of the day, where do you find community? How do you connect in to the community, however you define that? What does that look like for you? And if you find yourself, you're like, wow, I have all of these connections. Great, that's wonderful. If you find yourself saying, I don't have as many connections as I thought, that's still great and wonderful. What this is, it allows you to kind of look at where you're at in this moment of time that's always changing and to say, is there anything I want to add? Is there anything I want to take away? Or do I just want to be where I'm at? And that's perfectly okay. Resilience is about being able to adapt with those changes. And as much as we don't like change as human beings, it is a thing that we're always constantly dealing with. And so figuring out how to become more comfortable with that discomfort can be really helpful. Now, the last resilience factor, which is by far the most important, is having connection to healthy, safe relationships. And what I'm guessing is that's all of you sitting on this webinar right now. The fact that you are willing to tune into this, the fact that you're willing to take an hour out of a very busy day with all the things that you have to do and to say, let's learn more about this, means that you guys are committed in looking at how do I become a healthy, safe relationship, or how do I keep being a healthy, safe adult for other people around me. And so what we've found is that people who've experienced trauma need experiences with healthy people outside of their traumatized or abusive environments, especially people in positions of authority, because they've often had power used over them. So they need people who they perceive might have power over, and to tip that balance so that they can have power with that person. And that's what we can do when we provide healthy, safe relationships. It's about having felt safety with someone rather than perceived safety. What I mean by perceived safety is when I look into a room and I see a group of individuals and I sit down, I might assume that this room is safe. But if those individuals, for whatever reason, don't feel safe to me, my felt safety is not going to be there. So felt safety is always going to be different for each individual. And when we're committed to being healthy, safe adults, we know that that's going to be different for everyone that we interact with. But at the end of the day, we still want to try to be as safe as we can with that person, whatever that looks like for them. So I'm going to shift and share in the last kind of 10 minutes that I have about some of the tools that you can use to help you navigate just your day-to-day job and some self-care stuff. One of the things is considering becoming a compassionate observer. To maintain deep empathy for victims and survivors of trauma, we have to remind ourselves that the situation is ultimately theirs, and that they were able to get to this exact moment because of their survival skills. So this will help us establish rapport and build trust with clients in a much smoother process when we recognize that they're the one in control the entire time, right? We're balancing out the power dynamic. We're allowing clients to become the experts in their own stories. And it gives us the opportunity to be more flexible in our work when we kind of learn from behind. I know that's part of like those 2-gen strategies that you guys have. We want to really have this be client-centered, client-driven, and this allows us to do that. It doesn't mean that we're cold or that we don't have any empathy. We're just really allowing ourselves to take a back seat while the client drives. One of the things that really helps us do that is when we recognize that we are not here to rescue, we're not here to save, we're not meant to be a hero. No one is helpless. No one is helpless. Clients come to us and they have survived that moment in their whole life without us, all the way up until they got to us. Meaning we don't have to come in and save them. They can still keep on surviving, and they often will and do. We can be there to walk with them on their journey. We can be there to help offer options, to help advocate for their voice, to help them consider that there might be information and resources that they didn't know about yet. But we really want to think about how can we have a power with situation. Even if you feel like there might be times when you do have to follow policies or laws where you're like, well, I have a mandate. I shared earlier that I'm a social worker, so if there's child abuse and neglect or thoughts of harming themselves or others, the laws dictate that I have to follow protocol, and that's perfectly fine. I can still do this in a way that I'm not rescuing someone and having power with. What it comes to mind for me is when I think about when I've made reports to Children's Services in the past, I've asked the non-offending caregiver if they'd like to make that report with me. That way they can hear everything I've said, and if they'd like to add anything to the report, they can do that as well. And it becomes a collaboration that helps prepare the individual for that next step. And so they're not thinking that I said something that they didn't know about. We're really coming together to talk about how do we help everyone stay safe. My goal isn't to rescue anyone. My goal is that everybody's safe at the end of the day. What's yours to do? That's always kind of an interesting thing. I think our roles kind of ebb and flow. We get stuff put on our table that we didn't quite think that was going to happen. So when we drift from our lane and our role's not clear, it makes it really hard to figure out, like, well, what am I supposed to do? You're kind of existing in this gray zone. And so one of the things can be just trying to set boundaries or setting realistic goals, keeping in mind, like, you'll do what you'll say what you do, and kind of keeping your word in that sense. The other thing that we think about is know where you're at in your own trauma and resilience journey. Part of autonomy and building agency is knowing what that looks like for you. So if you don't know where you're at in your journey, it's going to be easier to be triggered by the work, and you may not even know that you were triggered. As Dr. Dan Siegel says, he calls it name it to tame it, meaning if we can identify what's happening to us, our brain can start building new pathways towards healing. So another thing that we can think about is give yourself permission to say no. Now, I know I can't hear you guys, but how do you guys say no? Do you say no? Do you say, I'm not going to do that? Do you walk away and not say anything and run? Do you say, I'll get back to you? I mean, everyone kind of has a different way of doing that, but thinking about, are there times where you can just simply say no? And if you're wondering, well, I can't say no, could you say, here's what'll work for me? Or can I get back to you? Or maybe even this isn't doable for me right now. Can we look at some other options? Now, I know Rob looked at me and said he might be the one that runs away, but I don't know if that works. I don't think you can run away from your boss when your boss asks you to do something. You got to be really fast. You still might have a conversation waiting for you when you come back, though. One of the things that we do see kind of happen in organizations is this culture of toxic positivity. And that's really when people kind of put their rosy-colored sunglasses on something and just try to make everything okay or positive when things aren't okay. And really, like we've talked earlier, when we see people using, like, just be positive or stop being so negative, what ends up happening is the other person's left feeling unheard. And when you don't feel unheard, or when you don't feel heard, then you're like, well, what am I doing here? How can I talk to my coworkers? You're not going to be able to debrief with people because you're like, well, I don't want to talk to them. They're just going to tell me, just be happy, right? In reality, I just need someone to say, wow, that was a really difficult session you had. That's challenging. Is there anything I can do for you right now? Right? People just want to be heard. Just like our clients want to be heard, other people just want to be heard. Oftentimes, it's not a fix-it kind of situation. It's, can you sit with me while I have this pain? While I'm trying to figure out what to do with this. Can you just sit with me and be with me for a moment? Now, this works best when we're talking about workplaces that are resilient. So we're talking about places that have a high trust culture. And when you have a high trust culture where you feel like you can reach out to people and you have healthy relationships, this is trust that's earned, not assumed. So when I walk in, I can't just assume that my coworker Gina is going to trust me. I have to earn that over time, or I have to have conversations with her. It can't just be something that I automatically get because I walked in and I'm part of the team. The other thing is we want to vet quality new hires, right? We want to bring people in that know what they're doing or who have a passion for being in this field and are open to learning. The other thing is to think about universal trauma awareness. So when I say that, that means that everyone can screen for trauma. It can be as simple as saying, hey, are you okay? Or do you need 5 minutes? And anyone can do that, because if you buy into trauma and resilience, you recognize that almost every single person you interact with could have some sort of negative or traumatic experience in their life. And so if you can approach everyone with that kindness of resilience, you can say, like, hey, it's okay if you need a minute, or I can cover this for a couple minutes. Why don't you go ahead and step out? Just making that a normal part of the process. We also look at better work-life balance for staff. How do we increase self-awareness? How do we balance out those workloads? How do you have opportunities to debrief with your peers or team members? Are you able to go to trainings? Are you able to get more education? Are you going to lose? Is it going to be held against you for productivity if you decide you want to go to a webinar? Right? Or is it going to be held against you and you have to make up those hours if you want to go to a day training, or you can only go if you've met your productivity for the month? Those are things that we want to look at. And the last is access to reflective supervision. And what I mean by this is more about supervisors taking on a mentoring role with their supervisees instead of a punishment kind of role. You can have accountability, But when you agree to help mentor someone and bring them into the field, you're invested in that person, and your organization is invested in that person, and you're really helping them exceed on their professional growth. You allow space for reflection for them to consider what this work means for them without holding it against them. You allow opportunities for collaboration. Maybe you do a supervision contract when you first get started to assign, this is what I'm going to do as your supervisor, this is what I expect, and you can do as the employee. Kind of set that power with dynamic right from the beginning. And that supervision happens regularly. If you don't have supervision on a regular basis, that is a concern. Supervision in this kind of field probably should happen weekly, if not every other week, because you need that space to be able to process. If you're not having regular supervision, then you might feel like, well, I'm on my own, I don't know what to do, I have to do all this by myself. The other thing I'd like to mention is that it is normal. It is absolutely 100% normal to seek out supervision, to seek out your own professional counseling as part of the work that we do. It's just a normal part of staying in this field for the long term, like I mentioned earlier. So it's okay to go get counseling. It doesn't mean you're any less than. It actually means that you're taking care of yourself. And even counselors go to see counselors. So it's just a part of this process. We're very social creatures, and we like to connect in with other people, and that helps us do that. This is just a quick reminder that all healing is not linear, and that oftentimes we will make mistakes along the road. So it's not just from point A to point B, but we're going to kind of ebb and flow everywhere. The other thing I like to share is just a little bit about mindfulness. Now, you might think like, oh, that doesn't work, da-da-da. And for some people it works, and for some people it doesn't. But for the people that it does work for, it does help them regulate their emotions. And some of the great apps that are out there are right here on this list. 10% Happier is for those of you who are like, I don't like mindfulness. It's not really about mindfulness. They never say that it's mindfulness. It's just different ways to kind of connect in with yourself. Now, this last one that I'm going to share with you is about tapping, and I'm going to try not to laugh as I talk about it because it says karate chop. Please don't karate chop your neighbors. If you have someone next to you, this is a solo activity. You are to tap on yourself, not to tap on anyone else. But you can really just take your first two fingers and kind of tap under your eyes or over your eyes while you're talking about some of the things that are stressing you, and it'll help you process through that. So if you're interested in that, you can definitely look more of it up. They use it a lot in schools and with young children. It really has helped kids kind of regulate and calm back down. And last but not least, the last thing I'd like to say is that you all make a difference, and that there's no program in a box that I could give you that can make a change and miraculously change everything within your organizations or your programs or even within you. The biggest thing is that you make the difference, that people, not programs, change people. And I hope that this was helpful in filling your cup or your bucket today. So with that, thank you.